there's been a lot going on with regard to this idea of software bill of materials in the industry at large. It started under that name about 6 or 7 years ago. It goes back further than that. In fact, I was on the very first mailing list that existed, which was called FOSS Bazaar Package Fax, run by HP in 2006. So I've followed this thing for a very long time, and almost 20 years now at this point. And I am very sure that this is a terrible way to think about software altogether at this point, that this entire SBOM thing is really just this weird hoodwink from big tech companies. And it all starts from the fact that the analogy that they're working with doesn't fit. So the SBOM people will tell you about how there's this thing called the software supply chain, and they will make analogy after analogy to physical supply chains. Now, I agree there are physical supply chains. We all learned that during the deep pandemic when the supply chains collapsed. Like, there are physical things that have to get moved around, and it's really complicated to move physical things on Earth. But is there really a software supply chain? I don't think so. I think it's a broken analogy that looks good because you want often to analogize digital goods to physical goods, but we in the free software world have known for years that was a terrible thing to do. The whole reason proprietary software exists is because they analogized it to physical goods and said, well, everybody should get one copy and each person should pay for one copy, just like a book, because it's just like a physical good. Well, of course we know that digital goods are not like physical goods. There are so many things you don't have to do. This is a really fascinating thing, shipping containers. How many people are familiar with how shipping containers in the supply chain work? Probably, I figured, you're geeks, so you know. Right, so these things have been spec'd out. They sit around in ISO meetings and debate like centimeters off the side of a lock and where it needs to be. And the reason, of course, as almost all of you raised your hand to know in the audience, they have to be able to load and unload and truck those shipping containers everywhere in the world with virtually the same equipment. And that's a hard thing to organize. I don't know of any analogy like that in software. Yes, we have to make APIs work where software has to fit together, but we don't have to build billions and billions of dollars of equipment to make sure we can move software from one place to another. There's also this idea of leakage, both literal and figurative, right? So if you're putting things on ships on the water, you can literally have boats sink, and you have to plan for that in the supply chain and figure out what to do if that happens. And then there's also the virtual form or figurative form of leakage, where pretty much everywhere in the physical supply chain, there are one or two employees who will steal stuff or lie about what was on the bill of materials or whatever to try and rip somebody off or benefit themselves financially. Again, nothing like that. There are no boats, no motor cars. We don't have a single luxury in software, frankly. So I just don't think there really is a software supply chain. I think it's a broken analogy. And because physical objects have all the attributes that we've already shown in free software that don't apply to software in general, but FOSS in particular, doesn't have any of the kinds of restrictions and problems that proprietary software does, that physical goods do. So I just think the analogy is broken. And so when you start thinking about talking about this bill of materials, well, the reason you have bill of ladings and bill of materials, which are different things, I don't even know what the difference is. You have those because physical goods are hard to manage and software goods are not so hard to manage. Not that they're easy to manage, but they're nowhere near as hard as physical goods. So why do we have all this rhetoric about there being a software supply chain? Why is there all this pressure? Well, manufacturing firms have figured out that what mostly they want to do, they want proprietary software to be the norm. And they don't necessarily want consumers to have all the rights that we care about in open source and free software. This has been the case since the beginning of proprietary software. Free software was ultimately an answer to these kinds of restrictions. So the entire idea of bringing in the analogy to physical goods into software is designed to restrict what people do with their software. So all of these concepts about a software bill of materials, about a software supply chain, they are all coming from rhetoric from companies that want to not give their customers FOSS, or maybe they want to give them a little bit of FOSS, but not, but the absolute minimum amount that they're required to. So I think it's a cute marketing term. I think it was very inventive. Many of you might know that the SPDX project was kind of floundering in irrelevancy. Suddenly SBOMs happened, and it was the most important project in humanity, at least according to the lawyers. And now we can write software bill of materials with SPDX, and suddenly it's this huge important project again, when it was pretty much no longer that interesting to anybody until all of this happened. It's also a complete marketing term. There is no formal definition of SBOM. Anybody who tells you there's a formal definition of SBOM is trying to sell you something. It's not defined anywhere in law. It's not formally specified in any ISO standard, anything like that. It is a term of marketing for a thing, which is basically a list of what software is in a particular physical computing device. Now, you'll hear a lot about the Cybersecurity Act, Cybersecurity Resilience Act in the EU. There are incredibly important issues going on with the CRA. There are lots of things we have to do in free software to make sure the regulations, which by the way, are not finalized until 2027. Anybody who tells you that CRA already tells you to do something doesn't know what they're talking about, because the regulations for what you actually have to do are still being written, and we should get involved and help the FSEF Europe in particular work on free software issues with CRA regulations. But as far as the SBOM thing goes, there's no mandate in the CRA that you have to provide SBOMs. Now, everybody who is into selling SBOM stuff to you will tell you that there is. So I read the entirety of the CRA. Well, I didn't read all of it, but I did search for SBOM everywhere and read in detail the large parts of the sections around where the word SBOM becomes. And there isn't actually a definition there either. So if you say, well, the CRA requires SBOMs, the CRA says the word SBOM, or says the acronym SBOM, but doesn't say exactly what that is. Here's one of the two places it appears. So I'll just read this out for the recording, just in case the slides don't come in. Market surveillance authorities should be able to request manufacturers to submit the SBOMs that they have generated pursuant to this regulation. In order to protect the confidentiality of SBOMs, market surveillance authorities should submit relevant information and dependencies to ADCO in an anonymized and aggregated manner. Okay, so it sounds like the governments can ask for an SBOM, but they haven't told you what an SBOM has to look like. It says manufacturers should identify and document components contained in the product with digital elements, including by drawing up an SBOM. Manufacturers should not be obliged to make the SBOM public. This is fascinating, right? So it doesn't define what SBOM is, but what it says is you can make secret SBOMs, and that's okay under the CRA, and you don't have to share them with anybody except the market authority if they happen to ask you for it at some point during some CRA proceeding. So is there an SBOM mandate there? I don't know. Another place SBOM's mentioned in the CRA, implementing powers should be conferred on the commission to specify the format and elements of the SBOM. Aha! Okay, so the commission has the right to define SBOMs under the CRA. It has not yet done so. And as I mentioned, we have until 2027 to lobby the European Commission to write the regulations. So I posit to you, we should define what an SBOM is, and we should define it as something useful instead of the goofy stuff that it's being defined at by the industry right now, who actually is trying to promote proprietary software. Now, before I move on to talking more about that, I've been talking about these EU regulations. You also might hear that there are US regulations that affect this as well, and there's US mandates for SBOMs. There was an executive order by President Biden. You might have heard there's been regime change. You might have heard that executive orders are being revoked from the past administrations and new ones are being issued by the minute sometimes. So I don't think anything Biden put in the executive order, which was problematic in itself. You'll find on SFC's website a open letter we wrote to the Biden administration about why that executive order was so problematic. But that executive order is completely moot at this point. So there is no. I'm going to take. I have so much time at the end for questions, so I'll get you at the end. There isn't anything in the U.S. right now that's mandating SBOMs, and we don't actually have, as you may have heard, people working at the places that would do that, right? I mean, you hear about these huge loss of workers at NIST, at NSF, and so forth. So I don't think in any time in the near future will there be anybody there to work on this issue here in the US anyway. So why is it that the industry loves SBOMs? Well, first of all, it's a wonderful substitute to actually doing what the licenses say. And I will tell you, before there was a word SBOM, I did a GPL enforcement action in 2000, and I can't remember if it was 6 or 7. And they sent us what you would call today an SBOM. They said, we comply with the GPL because we can list for you all the software that's in our device. And we told them, the GPL requires you to give us the complete corresponding source code, which means all the source code for all the modules contained and the scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. Where are those? They said, well, we gave you that list. That shows we comply with the GPL. So even way back then, almost 20 years ago, they were already using SBOMs as a way to skirt their big companies, tech companies, for-profit tech companies were using that to skirt their obligations under copyleft. And now it's even better because it's like, we have SBOMs. The CRA talks about SBOMs. We have SBOMs. That's what compliance is, SBOMs. When I gave a similar talk at FOSSDM right before I fell over from COVID, I actually listened to the talk while I was prepping for this one. I can tell I had COVID. Like I keep losing my breath in that talk. So I wish somebody told me I had COVID like right after the talk because it was obvious that I did in retrospect. Anyway, someone asked in that talk, a lawyer from Red Hat named Richard Fontana, and actually asked the question and said, I'm seeing people presenting SBOMs as if it's copyleft compliance. Are you seeing that too? And the answer is yes and yes. I have been seeing that since before there was the term SBOM, and we're seeing more and more of that, and Denver in his work can confirm that for you. Now, another reason that they love SBOMs is it helps them avoid copyleft. One of the things the industry has been trying to do for years is pressure as an unfunded mandate to upstream FOSS projects to perfectly document every single file what the license is. Now, let me tell you, a license has nothing to do with files. Licenses start, they don't finish there, but they start with copyright. And I defy you to find any copyright statute in the world that talks about source files. Right? It talks about works. Licenses are for works. And of course, you can license files. Well, years ago, I wrote an essay that explained how you could keep some files under copyleft, some files under not copyleft. One of the worst articles I ever wrote, not because it was wrong, but because I'm sad I educated people about that. But I'm learning these days that I should not have been so nice in my early career educating people about stuff because they just use it against you later. But while it is possible to do that, why is it that industry has been pressuring, oh, let's figure out how many licenses aren't copylefted technically, or how many files aren't copylefted in this otherwise copylefted project? And they go through the Git history and they go and ask developers to say, wouldn't you rather this be under a truly free license like 3-clause BSD or Apache? And they get all the developers to agree, and then they can mark that file. Oh, that's Apache, even though the whole work is under GPL-v3, these files are under Apache. Well, why have they been doing that? Because they have a plan. Their plan is, if we have perfect SBOMs for every single free software project, we can just automatically throw all the copylefted code away, see what we have left, and then we don't have to deal with those horrible pro-copyleft, pro-software freedom people anymore because we have all their other code to go and proprietarize. So SBOMs is a perfect tool for this job. I posit, does the free software community want that job done? Another reason why the industry loves SBOMs is they can create a perception about proprietary software. Now, we in the free software community have shown for years that free software is more secure. It is widely considered by any computer security expert that having the source code publicly available for software leads to more secure software in the long term, even if not always in the short term. And the fact is that proprietary software companies really, really hate that that's true. They hate that it's been academically confirmed. They really want to tell you, no, we are so great. We're Apple. We love your privacy. We are the most secure software company in the world. And the reason we're so secure is because everything is proprietary. And no one ever sees our source code but us. And you can trust us because we are the ghost of Steve Jobs. Now, this is all false. We know that. But SBOMs are a really great tool if you don't want to share source code, because then you could say, well, okay, you know what's in my product. I gave you a software bill of materials. You know everything that's in the product. And once you know, if there is a security vulnerability, you can check to see if that security vulnerability affects the software you have. You don't need the source code to find out, because I'll give you all the versions of all the non-copylefted false stuff that I put in there and proprietarize and refuse to give you source code for. And then you can check. And then you can go back to me and say, hey, I discovered that you use version 1.5.6 of library foo, and therefore you need to update my product. And you could just ask us for that. And of course we're going to do it, because you're going to pay us $1,000 a month per user in a service agreement that will promise that we do that. And so you can know when the security vulnerability happens, you can keep paying us, you can know we're going to ship out the security fix right away, and everybody's happy because we get paid for your service contract and a seat license for every user. So yet another thing that companies are doing with SBOMs and they love about them is they can avoid giving what is the most useful thing for cybersecurity, for resilience of software, for software security, and for consumer and customer rights, which is the complete corresponding source code as defined in the various GPL agreements, which include the scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executables. And another thing, which you have to add to this, because GPL, although Vagrant wants it to, GPL does not mandate reproducible builds, you also give them a reproducible build. I argue that the reason proprietary software companies don't want to give you this is because it does exactly what we always wanted to do in free software, which was to create a competitive free market for all software products. So that if you, as a customer, get the complete corresponding source code, including the scripts used to control compilation, installation, executable, and the reproducible build from your vendor, and you decide you don't like your vendor anymore, you have sitting on your hard drives every single piece of software artifact that you need to hire a different company to support your software. Proprietary software companies hate that because they're designed to lock people in. They're designed to take away your software freedom. So they don't want SBOM defined this way. But remember, the CRA is open to defining an SBOM. The European Commission may define an SBOM any way they want. I think we should tell them we want to define SBOM that way. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Now, the fact of the matter is making builds reproducible is hard. Vagrant's shaking his head. Okay, I'm wrong about that. There is work involved. It is not, builds are not reproducible upon coming into immediate existence. Is that at least true, Vagrant? Okay. So there is work involved to make a build reproducible, and this is work that proprietary software companies don't want to do for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that it's hard and it's extra work, and the other reason is they believe their process for building software is actually valuable and a secret that they want to keep. And they also don't really want to admit how hard it often is for they themselves to rebuild the software. So the SBOM thing is a great look over here kind of thing to say, but I gave you an SBOM, so don't you worried about reproducible builds? Don't worry about reproducible builds. I'll worry about reproducible builds. You worry about SBOMs, and I gave you an SBOM, and you have everything you need because SBOMs are great, and they're mentioned in the CRA, and it's wonderful. And I think we're going to discover, if we let the SBOM thing continue the way it's going, that we don't actually have what we need for cybersecurity, and that we've been misled by the industry on this. Years ago, I need to get in touch with, this is a retired lawyer now who worked for a major tech company. I don't say his name because I can't reach him because he's retired, and he's like seems off the grid, and I don't want to bother him as well. So I really want to ask him. I think he wouldn't care if I said his name, but I've never gotten permission. He didn't actually say it this way. This is heavily paraphrased. What he actually said to me was, it was right when this big SBOM ballyhoo was getting started. And I had this call with him, and I was like, so I guess the rest of your company's all working on SBOMs. The entire legal team, that's all I talk about now. I go to their talks. He said, yeah, I'm not working on any of that. I said, well, why not? I mean, isn't that the thing? He said, I've been a lawyer in the software industry for I think at that point it was in the end, it was like 45 years. I think it was 40 years at that point. And he said, there are kind of two types of lawyers that I've worked with over my career. He said, there's lawyers who do what I do. And he mentioned a couple of others, colleagues. I don't want to say who, because then you'll know which company. And he said, and then there's others lawyers. They're the list makers. They love making lists, and they believe in the lists, and they believe the list will save them or something. And I'm okay for them making lists. I don't have a problem with lists, he says, but I don't want to spend my career making lists. I don't think that's being a good lawyer. So I think SBOMs are the pinnacle of the list making lawyer. Now, we can't ignore SBOMs. I mean, I've told you all the horrible things about them and why we have a problem. We cannot ignore them because while there's no actual mandate, I showed you on the slide, the commission could someday define what an SBOM is. And so the actual active work we have to do is help the FSF Europe, Alexander in particular, there's two names, first name Alex, last name Xander, who's doing the work at the FSF Europe to convince the European Commission to understand this. SFC's Reproducible Builds Project is going to be working with him to try to get an SBOM definition that includes reproducible builds in the CRA or from the Commission for interpretation in the CRA. And the fact of the matter is, every one of you, if you work for even a medium size, let alone large tech company, it's going to happen to you. Bill Lundberg's going to come over your desk and say, so, yeah, we need to have a conversation. I saw the last software release you did, and we are putting all the SBOM cover sheets on every software release now. And did you get a copy of the CRA? And you're going to say, well, I got a copy of the CRA, and I just forgot the SBOM this time. Yeah, I'll make sure you get another copy of the CRA so you can make sure you go ahead and put those SBOM cover sheets on all your software. What I hope you can say to them is, well, the fact of the matter is, Lundberg, I had a meeting with the Bobs a couple of days ago, and we agreed that we would make all the software available to our customer, including the scripts used to control compilation, installation, and executable, and all the modules they contain. And we were going to make sure as well that the build was completely reproducible. So yeah, okay, I did get a copy of that memo, and I can generate the SBOM for you. I can generate it automatically, in fact, because my build's completely reproducible and I have all the source code. So I will be generating that, but I'm going to go ahead and give the customer software freedom. And the SBOM, it's just going to be generated by a very small shell script. So, as I said, I think this is what we should be saying SBOMs are. We should just co-opt the term and say, when somebody gives you a list of things that are in the product, so that's not an SBOM, but it doesn't give me any source code. SBOMs are supposed to have source code. Just start having that argument every time. They can't win it because there is no official definition of SBOM. So you're just fighting about what the definition is. Also, please go to the Reproducible Builds talk that's happening. Vagrant's there, and Chris Lamb, I guess, is not here yet, but Chris Lamb and Vagrant will be giving the talk tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Saturday, sorry, 2 days from now. And I really think that we can just take control of the term and decide what SBOMs are. We have a right to. I mean, it's our software, not the lawyer's software. So anyway, as I mentioned in the thing, I used to just say like politically dangerous things on my talks, like I just did. Now I say them every day again at bkuhn@copyleft.org. So if anybody in the audience, oh, Jim Wright's back there. Anybody in the audience is hoping to ruin my career or something, I'm just teasing you, Jim. That like follow me there, and then you can find out the worst things I've said lately. Anyway, I left a good amount of time for Q&A, so please just ask anything you'd like. And before I take the first question, I had to put this talk together in 48 hours because Karen waited until 48 hours before to go. So if it seems slightly unprepped, give me a break, please, when you ask questions. Go ahead. You've had your hand up for a while back there. No, right? Oh, you did, didn't you? Yeah, didn't you? No.
What's the executive order number?
I think it's been revoked. I don't remember. It's in our article, but the Biden one, the old Biden one. Yeah,
14288.
yeah,
There was a lot of them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
That one was not revoked.
So you're saying Trump is going to take one of Biden's executive orders and make sure it's obeyed?
I didn't say that. I said he did not revoke it. So yeah, in power.
I'll bet you $1,000 right now that never gets enforced by the Trump administration, if you'd like. Go ahead, Jim.
With some of the regulatory bodies in different countries and whatnot, and if there are particular things that you think are problematic, I want to hear about them.
So I'm gonna repeat the question because there's no way it came through on the recording. Jim's basically asking, well, hey, if there's things trying to be added to SBOM that are pro-proprietary software, what are they? He's saying, well, we don't actually want those. We're gonna, even though we're proprietary software, yeah, right. Right, understood. And Jim's from Oracle, which he just identified himself as, so now I can say that on the recording. I think it's not. I think it's the other way around, right? The goal of the kind of SBOM ballyhoo is to make the SBOM just enough to be a little bit useful to some people for some things, right? So it's not they're adding things to it. It's that things were subtracted before we had a chance to talk about it, right? So if we had been better activists, I'll admit that, as free software activists, we would have been there early on saying, which I wish I'd done. I actually participated and helped the SPDX project for years. I've contributed hundreds of hours to SPDX, which I wish I never did, because what I should have been doing is saying SPDX is a bad idea. We should require source code, like require everybody get source code, full source code for everybody. SPDX can be much thinner of a thing because everybody gets source code. And this kind of middle ground, or not even middle ground, it's like the minimalist ground of like, well, let's just give people a list of what's in there and use this analogy to physical goods to say that's all you need. That I think is a swindle. I really do. I think it's just trying to convince customers this is all you need, so that customers don't say, I'd rather have the source code. Why don't I find a company that's 100% FOSS like JMP, where I can get all the source code? Because I'd rather have that. I don't really want an SBOM. And I also, if I have all the source code, I can generate SBOM with the shell script. So anyway, I'll take the next question. I don't know whose hand. Can you all just quickly decide among yourself who's first? Because I don't know whose hand I went up first. And I don't want to be unfair. Okay, somebody started asking a question.
Okay, the confusion between SBOM and licensing, I find very dizzying. They are not the same thing. So I'm trying to figure out who, and they're saying who presenting the SBOM as evidence of license compliance. Who is accepting SBOMs as evidence of license compliance?
I mean, I don't know who's accepting it. It's been shoved down my throat to accept many times, so I can say that much. And as far as the licensing connection, so Case was asking about what's the connection to licensing and who's saying SBOMs are show compliance. Well, I mean, they can show non-existence of copylefted software, right? So a typical SBOM, again, there's no single standard, but a minimal SBOM is going to at least list all of the versions of all the software included that came from third parties, all of the files included, ideally checksums of every source file, and but at least checksums of maybe the whole tar file, and the license that it was believed to be under when it was incorporated, right? So you can possibly prove there was no copylefted software present. What I've been offered is it lists it's copylefted, so we told you what was copylefted. We won't have to give you anything else, which makes no sense at all. That's the kind of case where they're using SBOMs to get copylefted software out before they ever ship it to the customer. Right. I'm gonna get these in front because you already asked one before. Go ahead, one of you, pick one. yeah, go for it. I'll get you last thing.
So I'm coming from an automotive background here, and they've been doing software bill of materials long before they were even called that. While they do use it for license compliance these days, that's both for proprietary and free software. You know, when they ship a vehicle, they need to know how many license fees to pay to VxWorks or QNX or whatever, or PM maps and things like that, as well as know what do they need to provide to the dealerships so the dealers can do the GPL license compliance, because it's the dealer, it's the person the end customer has to go to. But the reason they've done that is not for license compliance. That's just come out in the wash. They've always done that because of legal obligations to do with safety, type approval, and so on. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that is an acceptable use for that? Even though they're now calling that SBOM, but they've been doing it for years.
Yeah, of course. So the question is, in automotive, is making these kinds of things that are now called SBOMs, but existed before they weren't called SBOMs. They can help in license compliance, but they help in a ton of other things, including safety and so forth. Is it worth it for that? I want to be clear that I'm not categorically against lists. I don't know. I only recently started making an electronic one, but I've always made a list before I go to the grocery store. I saw this on Mystery Science Theater once. I saw one of these shorts that told you you buy the wrong foods if you don't make a list first. And so I always make a list first so I don't buy the wrong foods. And I used to do that on paper. Now I just started doing that electronically. So making a list is a good thing. Knowing what's in your cart is a good thing, right? I want to know what's in my cart. I even make a list of what coupons are going against that, right? Those are all good things to do. It's not that the list is a bad thing in itself. It's that the list is being offered as a substitute for other things that we either A, should be demanding as an issue of software freedom and software rights, or B, that the customer should be demanding for its own rights to not be swindled by the proprietary software company. So I think it's not that there's not a use case, it's that they are trying to make every use case answer be SBOM so that they don't have to answer the questions about things like, why aren't you giving me source code? Josh, I'm going to get you, and you're over there still waiting. So let me get Josh and then move over there.
So the approach you're talking about makes a lot of sense, to go to the regulators dealing with the CRA and similar and say, hey, here's how you should define an SBOM, coming from the experts who've been working on this a long time. Is there potentially an opportunity as well to collaborate with the large organizations that are trying to define standards for SBOMs when their goals are aligned, and get them to include that in their various certifications? So things like SALSA levels, for example. Could we get that so that, SALSA level 2 means you have to actually share the SBOM with the customer and not just, send it to a regulator and keep it yourself?
Yeah, so the question is, there are a lot of regulators looking at SBOMs in various different places, and should we find interests align and advocate with those standards bodies, regulators, et cetera, not just necessarily the European Commission. I agree that we should do those things. I think one of the most difficult things, looking back in my 30 years of career as a free software activist, is that we really didn't do enough lobbying. We didn't do enough spending time with people at NIST talking about this stuff, all those kinds of things. And the reason why we didn't do it is because it's incredibly expensive to fund. I figured out, we had to make the decision at SFC. Here's a great example. It's going back to the EU, but it's a good example. We really felt this year we wanted to jump in and get involved with the commission about stuff with CRA, and we're like, we can't fund this. And basically, we went to the FSF Europe and said, you've got one person working on it. Like, what do you need us to do to support you? Tangentially, because that's the best we can offer right now. So I do think it's a good idea. I think the biggest problem is that the people who have the spare money to send folks to these places are proprietary software companies, and they are smart enough to they're smart enough to fund proxy organizations to do it on their behalf, who say they're doing it on behalf of we free software developers, but aren't. It looks like you have another question, Josh, but I want to get over to other ones first. Go ahead.
So I think what's interesting about the analogy is that those materials from supply chain security for tangible goods, it was never something that it's a list, and it's not meant to be the proof that something is secure. required, and then it was meant to help like create if there's a red flag or something else that would create a need for more review. I'm wondering if that's like, if you see from the software side, how something like, let's not call it SBOM, but whatever this list is that shows where potential vulnerabilities are, like what are those next steps? Because my background was in supply chain security back in the day with actual like tangible goods. A bill of material just meant that was what somebody said was on there, and the only reason people believed it was because whoever certified it along the way was seen as a trusted person. So that's where I see the SBOM, which I don't use that term, but that term being important for our security discussions here. But it was never just that list. So I mean, what else do you think can go into the package for creating like secure?
Yeah, first of all, I want to restate for the recording, especially because it's such a good thing that you said. So somebody in the audience who works in, who has in the past worked in physical supply chains points out that the bill of materials was never meant to stand on its own. It had to be certified by people who checked that it was correct and so forth. And it was just sort of, I'm going to paraphrase, but like a pathway into understanding what security in the supply chain, not the answer to security in the supply chain. And then the question is like, what, can we use that part of the analogy that they're using the analogy wrong in the first place, saying that it is an answer? What can we do for that? I mean, I think it's really important. One of the reasons I talk about it being a summary information, and that summary information is useful. Like a cover sheet's good. I mean, that's why I use that Office Space joke, because I mean, the TPS report in Office Space, which is the joke there, it is basically a cover sheet, right? And it doesn't really say what software testing they did. It summarizes the software testing they did. So I think the more we can say SBOMs are a good summary. For example, in our my big plan of advocating to make reproducible builds part of SBOMs, we can say, well, one of the things that ought to be included in SBOM is the name of every engineer and who they worked for that confirmed the build was reproducible. Why is that not in every SBOM? And if it's not, SBOM is clearly incomplete, because that means nobody checked to see if the build was reproducible, which means the build probably is not reproducible. So why is that not in an SBOM standard by itself? Even if we lose on the it must be reproducible to SBOMs mean reproducibility. Another point I want to say on that is another sort of tactic we can use. I realize it's probably a heavy lift to get the commission to define SBOM to mean reproducible build. But the other idea that we're working on is, can we convince the commission to put in their regulations that if you can prove A, your bill is reproducible, and B, you've given the customer absolutely every line of source code, including scripts used to control compilation, installation, and executable, can then you get out of some of the other requirements in the CRA that are really only there because you didn't give them the thing they really needed, and therefore you don't have to give them this goofy stuff that's sort of summary information because you gave them the real information. So that's another thing that we've been talking with the FSF Europe about advocating for. Same question I hasn't asked yet, and then I'll get back to you because you asked before. Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
So when we're talking about you talk about how they're making this analogy to supply chain and how it doesn't make any sense because there isn't really a supply chain. And then you talk a little bit about reasons why you think that it is. Do you think there's also a way in which the reason that this analogy is so attractive is because companies want to paint free software developers as suppliers in order to give them the responsibilities that a supplier in a supply chain would have?
So the question is, are manufacturers or regulators trying to paint free software developers as their suppliers to get something that they need? I think the answer to that varies by jurisdiction that's working on this. So the EU at the very last minute was aware enough to create specific language, basically because of some last minute lobbying that a number of people did about what open source means under the CRA. It's very, very poor language because it was like drafted in literally the last from my sources, it was like literally the last 48 hours that language was put together and thrown into the CRA before it was passed. So it's not very good, but there is some effort in the regulation side, which again is continuing on to 2027, to see if we can get for the commission to consider how to interpret that language such that there isn't a situation where free software developers are suddenly a supplier and have obligations, and it's an unfunded mandate to them. The biggest problem with that answer that's in the CRA, which is called the open source steward system, which is a big complex thing, is that it's creating a race to the bottom for open source stewards who want to just be middle people between the free software developers and then basically suck up any revenue that's there. So the revenue doesn't get back to the real developers and just costs money because the open source stewards statify it. And I know Alex at FSF Europe is working heavily on trying to make sure that doesn't happen in the final regulations. You've had your hand up for a while, and let me get to you again.
Controls inheritance and satisfiability for audits is the topic. The main way that I interact with people asking me about what software contains is they are looking to do some kind of like audit or assurance activities, and they just want to know what's actually there. What are any of your opinions, or do you have any on like what we should be thinking about for SBOM related to controls inheritance, assignment of liabilities and obligations, kind of team up what he's saying here, but I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts. I'm sure I'll catch you outside maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I mean, how close is to what you're asking to the mergers and acquisitions kind of questions that people have? Is it similar to that issue of like trying to pass?
Acquisitions is often coming, like there's like some assessor who's coming to me and who just wants to fill out their spreadsheet with like the answer that says someone or
Who is liable for this thing?
liable for which thing,
Right.
turn on which logging, like we don't care, we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that I don't. So the question is sort of, it sounds like it's more. That sounds more like a government context. Are you asking in a government context? Or it happens in corporate too? Okay, yeah. I mean, again, I haven't worked in government or corporate, so my thoughts may be kind of useless in that regard because I might not have an answer that gives you an answer for what to do there. I will point out that I don't think SBOMs. I've never seen what the industry calls an SBOM that would give you the answer to that question of who's liable for this. It will tell you what's there, but it doesn't usually have the information about who's liable to us for that component. Should it break? Should it fail? Should it have a security bug, et cetera? So it's not really offering that. I think you could certainly imagine adding things into that. I think what the CRA is trying to do, I mean, the CRA is very, very well intentioned. There's huge problems with it, but the intention is good, which is they want to be able to tell a manufacturer, basically a customer who's an industrial customer, that you have a method to figure out which manufacturer to yell at when your product breaks because you took their stuff. And so the CRA is actually trying to build these regulations that allow you to truly trace those kinds of questions of liability and so forth. And the whole open source steward program is more or less designed to create a liable organization in between. It's not really a liability thing, but it's close to that. It probably would check the box on the form that you're thinking of if you say, oh, that's the open source steward, therefore they're responsible for that component. So I'm not aware of any efforts in the U.S. I mean, even the Biden executive order should magically Trump decide to hire people back to make it happen, didn't really address any of these questions. It's not, the executive order is not the CRA. It was more of a go study these questions, not. Because, of course, I mean, I know things are changing now, but executive orders are not actually laws and not supposed to be laws, so it can't actually put anything into effect, or shouldn't anyway. But in the EU side, there's actually work being done. So I would really encourage you to follow what's happening there, because even though, I mean, if you do business in the EU, you're going to care about it. But even if you don't do business in the EU, understanding how the EU is answering these questions, I think the process in itself is it's incredibly complicated, difficult to follow, but it is at least fascinating to see how the EU is thinking about it. I think I can only have time for one more question because they gave me 5 minutes like 3 minutes ago.
Mine's very, very simple and quick.
Sure.
You're talking a lot about the CRA and how much that's having to make people think more carefully about what they're actually shipping. Have you done much reading about UNC 155, which is about cybersecurity maintenance of vehicles for up to 20 years?
Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with it. I've talked a lot to, there's this person who I'm blanking on his name, who put together just kind of this amazing Git repository of all these different types of regulations. And I remember reading about it in his list. And I'm not familiar with that enough to answer any questions on it. But there are people in the free software community who are trying to actually build the entire map of all these different regulations and how they're going to affect free software. And I'll find a link for you later for that repository.